Hello everyone, today's story is on Cynthia Kaufman, who was sentenced to death for killing 4 women. To date, 60-year-old Cynthia is currently on death row in California and has no scheduled execution date. Also, no living woman has spent longer on an American death row than Cynthia. Cynthia Kaufman was born on January 19, 1962 in St. Louis, Missouri. Her mother and successful businessman father were a couple, but her father eventually abandoned the family, leaving her mother to raise at least 3 children on her own. Fortunately for Cynthia, her mother came from a wealthy family, so she and her siblings lived comfortably and she grew up privileged. They were also raised Catholic and were taught about religion from a very young age. Despite her religious background, Cynthia fell in love with a boy when she was in high school and ended up getting pregnant at 17. Her and the child's father did get married, but their relationship was a horrible one. Her husband frequently assaulted her, and for years she felt as if she could not do anything about it. After 5 years of being in a horrible, rocky relationship, Cynthia mustered up enough strength to pack her bags and escape to Page, Arizona. She left without her child and a small amount of clothes. It was now fall of 1985 in Page, Arizona. Cynthia began waiting tables, and after only a few weeks of being in Arizona, she met up with a local criminal by the name of James Marlowe. James was born in 1957 and started his criminal career at the age of 10. He was sentenced to 3 years at the Folsom Prison for a series of home invasions. In prison, he became well known and established within the Aryan Brotherhood and sported Aryan and neo-Nazi tattoos. Despite James being a gang member, a 6-time divorcee, and into drugs, Cynthia moved in with him in his apartment. Their partying was too much for their neighbors, though, and because of the constant complaints, they were evicted from their apartment. Even though they were out of a stable place to live, they were still living it up. James had family in California, so they would bum places to sleep, steal valuables from family members, and leave to mooch and steal off of someone else. Their fun temporarily ended on May 8, 1986, when Cynthia and James got pulled over in Barstow, California. The officer who was responsible for the traffic stop discovered a small loaded pistol and some meth in Cynthia's purse. The only reason for the traffic stop was because James's 6th wife reported her car stolen, and the car Cynthia and James were in was indeed his ex-wife's reported vehicle. Both Cynthia and James were locked up. James was sentenced to only 6 weeks in jail for the theft, though. Cynthia got out before James, so she was able to visit him in jail. When they were both finally free, they attempted to live off of family again, but James's family had enough with the couple, and they were forced to figure living situations out on their own. They started sleeping in the woods, and their living conditions were so bad at one point that Cynthia and James both got lice. They didn't have access to soap or water, so they doused themselves with kerosene just to kill the lice. Soon after their lice debacle, the couple began robbing people by breaking into their homes. They committed home invasions in California, Kentucky, and Tennessee before making their way back to California. They were able to steal cash, jewelry, and even a shotgun. Cynthia felt like Bonnie and was so in love with James that she got a tattoo in honor of him. The tattoo was on a butt cheek, and it said, "I belong to the Folsom Wolf." It was now October 11, 1986. Cynthia and James were on the hunt for easy prey. They found 32-year-old Sandra Neary in Costa Mesa, California. Sandra was at an ATM outside of her bank and was attempting to withdraw some money. They took her, killed her, and left her body for dead all the way in the city of Corona in Riverside County. Police were called because she never made it back to her car, and her car was still parked in the bank's parking lot. Unfortunately, Sandra's body was not found until October 24, 1986. 4 days later, on October 28, 1986, a 35-year-old woman named Pamela Simmons was reported missing in Arizona. Police believe she went missing while trying to withdraw money from her bank account. They did not know at the time that Cynthia and James were behind her murder as well. Cynthia and James left Arizona and made their way back to California, but this time in the city of Redlands. On November 7, 1986, 20-year-old Karina Novus vanished from her last known location. A few days later, Lionel Murray went missing, and she was last seen shopping at a local mall. She never returned home and never reached out to anyone after that day. Linnell's boyfriend was so worried that he decided to do some digging of his own. Linnell was a psychology student who worked, and she also had a date planned with her boyfriend that she missed. Her boyfriend searched for any traces of her and ended up finding her car outside of the dry cleaning shop where she worked. He reported her missing to the police, and after a search, Linnell's body was found the next day on November 8, 1986, inside of a motel room in Huntington Beach. Cynthia and James never stayed put, so they weren't caught. Police ended up finding Linnell's checkbook in Laguna Niguel inside of a trash dumpster. Also in the dumpster was a fast food takeout bag with the names Cynthia Kaufman and James Marlowe on it. Murderers Cynthia and James were dumb and helpful enough to use their complete legal names. Detectives were then able to link Cynthia and James to a motel in San Bernardino. When authorities made it to the hotel, the manager opened the hotel room linked to them, and inside was evidence that Cynthia and/or James was practicing Linnell Murray's signature. Although authorities did not catch the couple that day, authorities knew they were closer to their trail, and a manhunt began to capture the killer couple. On November 14, 1986, police were given a tip that the couple was in Big Bear City, California. A lodge owner said he recognized his recent guests as Cynthia and James, but by the time the 100-man search team got to the lodge, Cynthia and James were nowhere to be found. The search team then spread out to search for the killer couple in the woods, and at 3 p.m., they were spotted hiking alongside a mountain road. Once Cynthia and James were spotted, they knew they had nowhere to run or hide, so they surrendered without a fight. After being arrested, detectives discovered that Cynthia and James were wearing clothes that they had stolen from the dry cleaning shop where one of their victims, Linnell, worked. After being questioned for a while, Cynthia admitted to killing Karina Novis, and she led officers to a vineyard near Fontana where they buried her in a shallow grave. Both Cynthia and James were charged with murder on November 17, 1986, and while awaiting trial, they were in jail with no bond. The separation between Cynthia and James proved to be too difficult, and their relationship did not last. While being locked up, they started to blame each other for the killings. Cynthia was so upset with James that when she received a jail visit from her lawyers, she pointed to her back when they asked her if she needed anything from the outside. After pointing, she told them that she needed help removing a tattoo that she got in honor of James. After sitting in jail for over 2 years, the couple's trial began on July 18, 1989. There was evidence stacked up against them. Fingerprints of Cynthia and James were found on Karina's car, and they were linked to a pawn shop where one victim's stolen typewriter was pawned. Cynthia and James were found guilty, and they were sentenced to death on August 30th. Cynthia was the first woman in California to be sentenced to death after the death penalty was reinstated in 1976.
I think I deserve to be in here for the rest of my life. I do, I know I do. I know I don't deserve to be out walking around with everybody else in normal society. I did something horrible.
Today's story is on Krista Pike, who is the youngest woman to be sentenced to death in the United States during the post-Furman period. She is currently the only woman on Tennessee's death row. Krista Pike was born on March 10, 1976 in West Virginia. Her parents did not remain in a relationship after they had Krista, and her father was absent from her life altogether. Krista's mother, Carissa Hansen, would frequently drink, use drugs, and party. Because of her mother's behavior, she was unable to care for Krista like a mother should, so her maternal grandmother raised her. Krista was a happy child and in a loving home. Things changed when Krista turned 12. Her mother, who was absent in her life, decided that she wanted to step up and be a mother. Within the first week of Krista moving in with her mother, Carissa, she was exposed to drugs and drug users. Her mother had not changed. Carissa introduced a whole new life to Krista that would lead her down a dark path. Krista would spend nights on the street smoking weed, and she started drinking as well. She suffered from a blood clotting disorder, and she also had reconstructive surgery on her forehead when she was 14 years old after getting into a car accident. She eventually decided that school was not the right path for her, and she dropped out of high school in the 9th grade. Soon after dropping out, Krista was busted for theft, arrested, and was sentenced to 30 days in juvie. While locked up, Krista had no access to drugs, and this allowed her to focus and apply herself in positive activities. She earned her GED and ended up joining the Job Corps in Knoxville, Tennessee, which is a social education program for low-income youth. She was studying computer programming, but eventually wanted to study to become a nursing technician. Like most young teens, being attracted to the opposite sex and exploring those attractions takes up a lot of time and focus. Her focus was diverted from studying to boys. She ended up meeting a young man by the name of Tadaryl Shipp in the Job Corps. Tadaryl was a year younger than Krista. The two quickly started dating, and they developed an obsession with learning about Satanism and the occult. Krista and Tadaryl began attending occult meetings, and their 18-year-old friend, Shadala Peterson, was interested in what they were doing, so she began to join the occult meetings as well. Satanism and Tadaryl were two things Krista was obsessed with. She was possessive over her boyfriend and was very jealous as well. One day, during an occult session, Krista made it known to Tadaryl and Shadala that she was upset her 19-year-old classmate, Colleen Slemmer, was hitting on her boyfriend. She convinced her boyfriend and friend that Colleen needed to be sacrificed in the name of Satan. No one stopped Krista from her beliefs or tried to calm her down about her ill feelings towards Colleen. Instead, they devised a plan that would bring Krista's idea into fruition. On January 11, 1995, Krista said that she was just feeling mean and had a one-track mind. She asked Colleen to meet her near an abandoned steam plant by the University of Tennessee campus so they could make peace, drink, and smoke weed. Colleen accepted the offer, but Krista, however, had no intentions of squashing anything with Colleen. She was quoted saying, "That little whore has to be taught a lesson." On January 12, 1995, Krista, Tadaryl, and Shadala signed out of their dorm rooms and made it through the woods to meet up with Colleen. As soon as they spotted Colleen immediately started to apologize for the misunderstanding, but the trio began attacking her. The attack lasted for 30 minutes, and they did a number of horrendous things to Colleen's body before ultimately killing her. After killing her, Krista took a piece of skull as a souvenir and then carved a pentagram in her chest. Krista, Tadaryl, and Shadala left nude from the waist up Colleen in the woods. With no shame, Krista returned to the Job Corps and started to show off the piece of skull she took. School logs show that all 4 of them checked out, but only 3 checked back in. Rumors were spreading, and within 36 hours, Krista, Tadaryl, and Shadala were arrested. Police discovered the piece of skull in Krista's jacket pocket, and upon a search of their dorm rooms, they found a satanic Bible. Krista admitted to killing Colleen, but claimed she only wanted to scare her, but it got out of control. An autopsy was conducted on Colleen, and there were a number of defensive wounds on her. The ultimate cause of death was a result of blunt force injuries to the head. While being questioned, Krista accepted responsibility, but refused to name her boyfriend and friend as accomplices. It wasn't until trial when a friend testified that Tadaryl Shipp and Shadala Peterson were her accomplices. During trial, not only did prosecutors have a lot of evidence, but they had a confession as well. A student at the Job Corps by the name of Kim Iloilo testified that before the murder, Krista told her that she intended to kill Colleen. The court was also made aware of the fact that after killing Colleen and back at the dorms, Krista told another friend, Stephanie Lee Wilson, that she killed Colleen and saved a piece of her skull. Dr. Eric Engen, a clinical psychologist, examined Krista and said that she was an extremely bright woman for having a 9th grade education and that her IQ was in the 77th percentile. He diagnosed her with borderline personality disorder, but concluded that there were no symptoms of brain damage and she was not insane. On March 22, 1996, Krista was found guilty of murder. On March 30th, she was sentenced to death by method of electrocution for the murder charge and 25 years in prison for the conspiracy charge. Tadaryl received life in prison with the possibility of parole, and Shadala, who became an informant, only received probation after pleading guilty to being an accessory. Krista was taken to prison and for some time was a model prisoner. On August 24, 2001, however, Krista attacked and attempted to kill fellow inmate Patricia Jones. She was unsuccessful and was charged and convicted of attempted first-degree murder. Despite her crime, she continued on with her appeals of getting her off of death row. In an appeal, it was documented that she was allowed to go outside for recreation with non-death row inmates, but over time, she was segregated in a different unit of the prison and had to go outside alone, restrained, and handcuffed. Even though she claimed to have done good things like trying to teach other inmates how to read, she was cited for creating disturbances and actually lost her prison job. Losing her job also lost her privilege of being able to socialize with other inmates. Her cell was searched twice a day, and Krista admitted that the harsher treatment was the result of prison staff finding prescription medication in the wall of her cell. Krista complained that life was getting harder for her in prison, and all of her personal belongings were taken and/or destroyed. She started receiving help for her mental health and was prescribed lithium. In the appeal, she claimed that the lithium did not allow her to have good sleeping patterns. There were also other complaints in the appeal, like her being moved to a different facility and refusing to go outside because they did not have a lot of equipment. She also complained of only being able to use the phone twice a month. Krista was tired and wanted to remove her petition. She was tired of appeals and doctor's reports, but during the appeal, they were trying to convince her to think it over. They questioned her decision because she still requested for her sentence to be commuted to life in prison, and they wanted her to still meet with mental health experts. Dr. Kenner brought up how Krista experienced a lot of emotional neglect, and he, along with Dr. Engum, suggested that Krista suffered from borderline personality disorder. They mentioned that Krista suffered from substance abuse, and she frequently felt alienated from others and did not have the best interpersonal relationships. They claimed that people with borderline personality disorder are more likely to have poor anger control, and pairing that with them diagnosing her with depressive disorder, PTSD, dissociative identity disorder, and intermittent explosive disorder made it really difficult for Krista on a day-to-day basis. She would also sometimes fantasize about extreme violence. They also claimed that after so many years in solitary, Krista developed OCD. Multiple doctors concluded that with her wanting to withdraw her petition, Krista was not making a voluntary reasoned thought. Krista agreed with most of Dr. Kenner's assessment, but she confirmed that the disorders did not prevent her from understanding her legal options. Her sound reasoning for withdrawing the petition was not because of her complaints of the prison's conditions, but because life in prison was worse than death. She also claimed that her mind would not change no matter how long she was on her new medication, so she did not need more time. She carefully considered her choice to proceed with an execution in under 5 years. She said all of this while crying and was quoted saying, "That's the reason I sit here and cry, not because I don't want this, but because I don't want to hurt them. It's just really what I want, and I want to stay who I am, and I want to die being who I am. I sat in this very courtroom with the jury that found me guilty and sentenced me to death. So if that many people decided that this is what I deserve, and that that's what my punishment should be, then I'm ready for that. I've accepted that. I don't want to live in the penitentiary for the rest of my life knowing that I'm going to die in there one way or another. Whether I get a life sentence out of this or whether I keep my death sentence, I'm dying a little more each day, and I want to still be me when I go. And the way that people treat me, inmates, guards, or whatever, I don't want them to turn me into somebody cold and mean and cruel that doesn't care about anybody or anything except for living day-to-day life in the pen. It's like 23 pulling off a Band-Aid. I'd rather just go ahead and get it over with. Now. But I hope that you can feel what I'm saying. If you can't, just really understand it through my words. And I know that Dr. Kenner says that this medication or whatever is going to make me change my mind, but it's not. I've been thinking it through ever since I got this sentence. And even though I've never voiced it, and I haven't just told everybody about it, it's been years. It's been about 5 years that I've been wanting this, but it's just really what I want, and it's what I need as I'm being who I am. I want to die being who I am. The courts finally agreed to schedule her execution and set a date for August 19, 2002. Criminal Court Judge Mary Beth Lebowitz granted the request. On July 8, 2002, however, Krista changed her mind, and defense lawyers filed a motion to allow the appeal process to continue. The motion was initially denied, but on August 2, 2002, there was a 3-judge state appeals court panel, and they ruled for the execution not to be carried out. It is now the year of 2022, and Krista has no more petitions left under the appeals procedures in the state of Tennessee, but she has yet to receive an execution date. In March of 2012, Krista was caught making escape plans with Correctional Officer Justin Heflin and a man on the outside, Donald Kohut. Donald was visiting Krista in prison and agreed to assist her. Their plans were interrupted because during that time, the Tennessee Department of Corrections, the New Jersey State Police, and the Tennessee Bureau of Investigations were conducting a joint investigation. Donald was driving 1,800 miles by car from New Jersey to Nashville, Tennessee to visit Krista. Donald was arrested and charged with bribery, official misconduct, and conspiracy to commit escape. He was eventually sentenced to 7 years in prison. Officer Heflin served no prison time but was fired from his job. In 2020, Tennessee Attorney General requested that an execution date be set for Krista. During this time, the pandemic was affecting our country, and the state agreed with Krista's attorneys and allowed extensions. The last motion for an execution date to be postponed was on June 7, 2021. There has yet to be a decision on whether or not her sentence will be commuted. If she is executed, she will be the first woman in the state of Tennessee to be executed in about 200 years.
Heavy burden feels lifted. I feel like now we can start trying to heal. We don't have this over our heads. We know where she's going to be, we know where she's at, and she's taken care of.
It all started on Friday, October 9th, when 911 operators received a call from a frantic woman at around 10:20 in the morning. The call came from a Jessica Brooks. Her 21-year-old daughter, Reagan Michelle Simmons Hancock, was unresponsive on the floor, surrounded by a large pool of blood. What frightened Jessica even more was the fact that Reagan was 34 weeks pregnant with a baby girl who had already been given the name Braxlyn Sage Hancock. When police arrived at the scene, they noticed blood on furniture, walls, appliances, and other items within the home. Reagan was lying face down. Hoping to see if Braxlyn was still alive, EMS personnel attempted to check the status of Braxlyn, but as soon as Reagan was turned over, they noticed an extremely large incision from hip to hip on Reagan, and Braxlyn was nowhere to be found. Police enlisted the help of Texas Rangers so they could begin an investigation of Reagan's murder and the disappearance of Braxlyn. They arrived at the scene of the crime a little after noon, and they communicated with police that they believe they inadvertently came across Braxlyn and the suspected killer an hour before the 911 call came in from Jessica. The story relayed was that a Texas state trooper pulled a vehicle over in DeKalb, Texas, a little after 9:30 in the morning. The officer conducting the traffic stop noticed a woman in the driver's seat with a newborn in her lap. The officer identified the driver as Taylor Parker, and after the officer noticed the umbilical cord still attached to Braxlyn, Taylor communicated with the officer that she had just given birth. The officer had no reason to not believe Taylor because the umbilical cord looked like it was coming out of Taylor's pants, and there was also a mess in the car. Taylor began giving CPR to Braxlyn until EMS arrived, and they ended up taking both Taylor and Braxlyn to the hospital in Idabel, Oklahoma. Taylor spoke with hospital staff, claiming that Braxlyn was her biological child and was most likely oblivious to the fact that medical professionals would be able to tell if a female had recently given birth. When authorities and detectives spoke with the hospital staff, they were finally informed that Taylor had not given birth and Braxlyn was not hers. Special Agent Dansby spoke with Taylor while she was still in the hospital. She admitted to Special Agent Dansby that she got into a physical altercation with the mother of Braxlyn and admitted to leaving the house after she was able to successfully take Braxlyn. Hospital staff also had to deliver the news to authorities and Reagan's family that Braxlyn did not survive. An autopsy was conducted on Reagan, and they mentioned that her incision was made with a small scalpel and her whole uterus had been removed. She attempted to fight off her killer as best as she could, but succumbed to the 100 wounds on her body and head. The scalpel was not even found until later because it was lodged inside one of her wounds. 27-year-old Taylor was immediately arrested and sent to the Bi-State Detention Center. Taylor had 3 separate charges, 2 of which were capital murder and murder. She appeared in front of the 202nd District Court in Bowie County, Texas, and her total bond was set to $5 million for all 3 charges. Investigators ended up interrogating Taylor, and speaking with other witnesses to get a full story behind why Taylor did what she did. They found out that 10 months before the murder of Reagan and Braxlin, Taylor, who was in a relationship with her boyfriend, was experiencing relationship problems. Her boyfriend wanted to leave her, so she decided to fake a pregnancy in order to keep him around and by her side. Taylor went as far as to post her pregnancy online, sharing with people that she was going to have a gender reveal party. She disguised her stomach to look pregnant, and she even faked ultrasounds. Everyone around her believed she truly was pregnant, and her plan kept her boyfriend temporarily by her side. What is even more shocking than Taylor making many people believe she was pregnant is the fact that no one, not even her boyfriend, knew she had a hysterectomy and would never be able to conceive. Taylor was so obsessed with convincing people of her lie that she spent hours researching how to fake a pregnancy, and she also researched by reading and watching videos on how to deliver preterm babies that were at least 35 weeks. Taylor's boyfriend, Wade Griffin, was interviewed, and he told detectives that Taylor did in fact tell him she was pregnant and was due in November, but was going to the Idabel Hospital to pre-register for labor to be induced for the birth of their child on October 9, 2020. He also communicated with detectives that they had just recently had a gender reveal party celebrating having a girl, and he was supposed to meet with Taylor at the hospital at around noon for the birth. Wade believed every word Taylor had said to him. Although they had loved each other, their relationship began in July of 2019 after meeting at a rodeo and developing their relationship online. They met each other's families, but he described their relationship as an emotional roller coaster and had threatened to leave Taylor before. His escape was the long hours he worked, working for a roofing company along with side jobs for welding, hog trapping, and managing livestock. Wade also communicated that he loved to eat, and Taylor would always have a hot meal waiting for him when he came home. She catered to him and would do anything for him not to leave her side, even if that meant coming up with elaborate lies. Early in their relationship, Taylor claimed to come from money and even asked Wade to complete a job on a property that would have totaled $50,000. Wade enlisted the help of his friend Juan, a family man with 4 kids. Taylor gave the men one check, but of course, not really coming from a rich family, she was unable to keep paying her boyfriend and his friend, so she lied by telling Wade that her mother found out about the job and shut it down. Wade started paying Juan with his own money, but in the end, he had to tell his longtime friend that there was no more job. Wade said that his friend broke down crying because he was without work and was promised a large sum of money. That is when things started going downhill in their relationship, and to keep Wade, Taylor told him that she was pregnant. When investigators broke the news to Wade that Taylor was never truly pregnant and how she had a hysterectomy back in 2015, he was crushed and agreed to testify against her in trial. When Taylor's trial began in late 2022, it came to light that Taylor was a habitual liar. The court was made aware that early in Taylor and Wade's relationship, she used a text app which changed her number, and she posed as her father, Mark Morton. Posing as her father, she texted Wade and told him that he was in a wreck and his bush hog was totaled. Taylor then told Wade she was going to help him and get the damaged farm equipment towed. Taylor met up with the so-called man named Jace, who was a family friend helping her with the wreck, and as Jace was attaching the bush hog to the towing cable, a winch snapped and the towing cable hit her in the stomach. She then communicated to Wade that she was carrying, and the incident made her miscarry. That was the very first time Taylor tried to make Wade feel sorry for her and play with his emotions about being a possible father. These lies did not come to light until after Taylor was arrested for the murders of Reagan and Braxlin. At one point, Taylor had even claimed that she had twins that she lost. When it came to money, Wade said in trial that Taylor told him that her mom was hogging all of the family's oil and gas royalty money, but her grandmother was going to set up an account where she would be able to access some money. Taylor went as far as creating more fake texts and emails that she would share with Wade about funds she was to receive. Wade was quoted saying, "I'm kind of blown away. I really didn't know what to think. It all sounded good. I just couldn't believe it was coming on so fast. Her parents texting me, her grandparents texting me, telling me, you get married, and this is what you're pretty much looking at. Taylor was trying to force Wade into marrying him by throwing the idea at him from all angles and fake relatives she created. Getting back to the pregnancy that led her to kill Reagan. He did notice Taylor wasn't growing or showing, and she just told him that it was because of her tummy tuck, and she did not carry like most petite women. Wade asked his mom if he believed a tummy tuck would prevent her stomach from growing, and she told him that would never be a reason. Wade told the court that he asked his friend Roger and his girlfriend if they thought Taylor was pregnant, and his friend responded by saying, "You don't need to have no doubts. She's pregnant. Quit thinking like that. Come September, you're gonna be a daddy." The reason Roger and his significant other were so adamant about Taylor being pregnant was because they each felt Taylor's stomach, and they said they felt a kick. It was strange because any time Wade tried feeling her belly, he never felt a kick. His doubts ended up going away because Taylor was too convincing. After the murder, Wade ended up finding out that Taylor purchased a fake belly for her maternity shoot. After Wade testified, a prison mate of Taylor's testified. She said that Taylor confided in her and said that before leaving Reagan's home, she placed Braxton's cheek against Reagan's cheek and said, "Tell Mama bye." The inmate also told the jury that Taylor told her that she was taking Braxton to get a record of her birth, and when she was pulled over, she tucked the cord into her pants so responding officers would assume that Braxton was hers. Taylor Parker was offered a chance to testify, but she refused to speak in front of the court. When it was time for the jury to deliberate, they found Taylor guilty of all charges, and they found no mitigating circumstances in her past that would justify giving her life in prison instead of death. Judge John Tidwell agreed with the jury, and Taylor was officially sentenced to death. In a victim's impact statement, Reagan's sister Emily Simmons made a statement about her upcoming wedding. "My only biological sister. You need to understand what you took from me and my family. No more celebrating her birthday. I was barely 19 when I got the call my sister was gone. She will never be my maid of honor. If I visit my sister, I have to go to a graveyard and see a headstone." Emily was soon to be married when trial was taking place, and she told the press that she would have to carry a picture of Reagan down the aisle because her sister would not physically be there to do it herself. To date, 30-year-old, 5'4", 220-pound Taylor is on Texas death row as of November 9th, 2022.
I don't feel guilt in the sense that if I had done something differently, that it could have been prevented. I don't feel that type of guilt. Sometimes I feel that I could have said something earlier about the things that Adrian was doing, and maybe earlier it could have been prevented, or maybe not even agreed with it at first. I ask myself, what could I have done differently? You know, I do that, but not to the extent that I feel guilt about it, no.
Frances Elaine Newton was born on April 12, 1965 in Texas. She grew up in a large religious family with 10 other siblings. She said that she got along great with her siblings and that her parents treated her fairly well. Despite growing up in a loving home, Frances chose to hang around boys that were getting into trouble and ended up meeting a young boy by the name of Adrian. The two became sexually active, and Frances had her first child when she was just 15 years old. Her son's name was Alton. Frances and Adrian stayed in a relationship together despite their age, and Frances was able to continue living with her parents. Although they were a Christian family, Frances expressed that her family was very supportive. Even though they did not encourage teenage pregnancy, they were there for her, and she was able to graduate high school and eventually become an accountant.
I had a lot of support. I had my first child early. My parents were very disappointed in me, but they said, okay, this happened, don't make the mistake again, you know, and they encouraged me to continue being a teenager because I was a teenager. But at the same time, they helped me to be a good mother to my son. And Adrian's mom and dad were very supportive, as was he.
It must have been tough, so young.
You know, it really wasn't, because I had my big sisters and my big brothers, and so my son had all these aunts and uncles around and grandparents. It really wasn't tough. I mean, and I don't say that to encourage teenage pregnancy. I think that I was very blessed to have the support that I did.
Frances and Adrian ended up having another child together, a little girl named Farah. They got married and ended up moving in together in an apartment in Houston, Texas, but their relationship was far from perfect. Adrian became a drug addict, and it's been documented that both Frances and Adrian would buy, sell, and use drugs together. Adrian was also not faithful and cheated on Frances multiple times. After finding out that her husband was cheating, Frances decided that she would do the same thing to get back at him. Adrian ended up finding out about Frances cheating on him, and they both agreed they were no longer going to cheat on each other. Their pact meant nothing, and they both ended up getting into new relationships with other people while still married and living together.
Adrian hadn't been faithful in a marriage for several times, and on my part, after so many times, I thought, okay, well, I'm gonna do this and let him see how it feels, and I did, and that wasn't a good thing on my part. So one of the things that I was gonna fix is I wasn't gonna do that anymore. Unfortunately, I had started a relationship with a guy that I'd gone to school with, and of course he was upset about that, and I wanted him to be, because I wanted him to feel what I had felt, and when I say that I wanted to fix it, that's one of the things that I had done, is said cut that relationship off. And he said that he would quit doing, quit running around, he would quit doing drugs, and he would quit doing illegal activity.
Adrian was still dabbling in drugs and had his brother Sterling move in with him and his family. Adrian got into trouble with the law quite a few times, but Frances was no stranger to getting in trouble either. In 1986, at the age of 21, she was busted for forgery, and although she was able to avoid prison time, she was sentenced to probation for 3 years. A previous employer also came out at a later date, stating that Frances was fired from her job for stealing. The same year she was sentenced, a State Farm agent by the name of Claudia Chapman proposed the idea of selling Frances auto insurance. Frances did not want it, so it's been said that Claudia initially suggested getting life insurance policies because they had benefits of acting as savings accounts. Frances said that she initially turned down that offer as well. In February of 1987, Frances's cousins died in a house fire, and the family could not scrape up enough money to pay for proper funerals. It was then that Frances's father told her that she should prepare for the future because anything could happen, and it was in her best interest to get life insurance policies on her family members. A month after the death of her family members in March of 1987, Frances decided to take out life insurance policies on her 23-year-old husband Adrian, herself, and her daughter, and there was already a policy on her son. The life insurance policies were $50,000 on each person. In order to complete the deal, Frances, who had already gotten into trouble for forgery, had no issues forging her husband's signature. Her mother was also listed as the secondary beneficiary. According to Frances, Adrian told her he quit using drugs, and she believed him because normally he would hide his drugs in the medicine cabinet, and when she went to check the cabinet, there were no drugs there. She also mentioned that Adrian would be so scared some nights and sleep under the bed. She feared that Adrian was afraid of a drug dealer who was threatening his life, but the events leading up to Adrian's death said otherwise. After taking life insurance policies out on her husband and children, it was the evening of April 7th at the apartment complex located at 6126 West Mount Houston Road in Houston, Texas. Sterling was at the apartment with Adrian and Frances, and at around 6:45 p.m., Adrian spoke to his girlfriend Ramona Bell on the phone for approximately 15 minutes. Frances was there when Adrian was speaking with Ramona, and Ramona said at a later date that Adrian told her he was going to sleep after Frances left that evening. Finally, at around 7:15 p.m., Adrian received another call from a friend by the name of Alphonse Harrison, but this time Frances answered the phone and asked him to hold. Alphonse was on hold for 45 minutes and decided to finally hang up the phone. Even though Alphonse testified about the time he called their house, Frances said she left the apartment at 6 p.m. in order for Adrian and Sterling to talk to each other, and she needed to leave to pay her car insurance. She admitted to answering Alphonse's call, but asserted that he was wrong about the time in which he called. Frances's cousin Sandra said that Frances drove to his house at 6524 Sealy Street in Houston, Texas, which was about 13 minutes away from her apartment. Frances then asked Sandra to come back to her apartment, and Sandra said that he noticed Frances take a blue bag out of her car and then walked it over to the burned-down abandoned house next door that her cousins perished in. Between 7:45 and 8 p.m., Frances and Sandra made it to Frances's apartment, and the phone rang immediately. Frances answered it, and Sandra could hear her say, "I think he's asleep. I'll see if I can wake him." That's when Frances said that she discovered that Andrew, Alton, and Farah had been killed. The person who called was on hold, but Sandra ended up ending the call in order to call 911. The caller was Alphonse, so Sandra was able to testify a more accurate time he called, which was after the murders. At 8:27 p.m., R.W. Ricks from the Harris County Sheriff's Department was dispatched to 6126 West Mount Houston Road. Rick was the first officer to arrive at the scene of the crime, and he discovered the dead bodies of Adrian, Alton, and Farah. Adrian was lying on the couch while Alton and Farah were in their beds. A day after the murders, an anonymous female called the Harris County Sheriff's Department and let them know that there was a red pickup truck at the scene of the crime and gave them a license plate number. She said the person getting into the truck was a black male around 30 years old. Police had this tip, but did not follow through with obtaining any more information and did not question the individual driving the pickup truck. As time passed, Sandra went to police and let them know that Frances put a blue bag in an abandoned house that belonged to her parents. Police ended up going to that abandoned house and found the blue bag, which contained a .25 caliber semi-automatic pistol. Police then took the gun in for tracing and found out it belonged to a Michael Mouton. After speaking with investigators, Michael informed them that he loaned his gun to his cousin, Jeffrey Freelow. Investigators then spoke with Jeffrey, and he said that he usually kept the gun in his drawer in his bedroom, but his girlfriend did his laundry and had easy access to it. Upon further talking, investigators found out that his girlfriend was none other than Frances Newton. On April 21st, Frances filed claims on the life insurance policies, and she was arrested the very next day and charged with capital murder. During trial, investigators said that although there was no blood found on Frances, there was gunpowder residue on the hem of her skirt. Defense argued that the nitrates found on the skirt was fertilizer. They expressed that nitrates could be found in cosmetics, tobacco smoke, fertilizer, and urine. Frances's uncle let investigators know that they had a large garden with a lot of fertilizer, and he thinks Frances came in contact with the fertilizer. During trial, everything about the nitrates was only what the jury heard because the state failed to conduct tests to prove where the nitrates truly came from. Defense also argued that there was no residue on her hands or shirt, and if the victims were shot at close range, that would have definitely been found on her. They also made mention that the pistol found in the abandoned house was the murder weapon. Frances supposedly had another gun and kept mentioning that it was not the murder weapon.
There are so many things that I don't know and I don't have answers to, but there are some things that I do know, and that I know that if a jury knew, that they would have come to a different decision. The issue with the ballistics and the gun, they would have found out that the shell casings found there didn't match the weapon that they're saying is the murder weapon. That still hasn't been brought up in any of the court hearings, you know, and that's that's something I didn't know, but that one of the attorneys working on the case now told me about. And those are like fingerprints. It's something that wasn't brought up in trial, you know, and I think that the jury should have been able to hear that. What I know is that Sergeant Freeze told my father when he came to get me from my parents' house that there were 2 guns in the state's possession, and the gun that I had wasn't the murder weapon. He told my father I would be back for that reason. Ron Mock, when I was first arrested and began going to court, he told us that there were 2 guns in the state's evidence, and the gun that I had wasn't the murder weapon. as far as the ballistics test coming back saying that the gun in the state's evidence is a murder weapon, I don't know. You know, it may be, but what I know is that the gun I had the day that I left my apartment is not the murder weapon.
During trial, Sterling, Adrian's girlfriend Ramona, Alphonse, Sandra, and Jeffrey all testified. There was an ear witness who also told investigators that he heard a gunshot at around 7:30 p.m., but he did not testify in front of the jury. Frances, on the other hand, asserted that she did not kill her family and it was a drug dealer who committed the murders. She said that Adrian owed his dealer, Charlie, $1,500. Adrian's brother Sterling spoke with investigators, and he claimed that it was true that his brother was in debt and let them know where the drug dealer lived. Although investigators had this information before trial, they never followed the leads and did not follow through with the drug debt being the cause of the murders. Frances was questioned about forging her signature on the life insurance policies, and she said that the only reason why she did it was to prevent Adrian from learning that she had set money aside for the payments because she was afraid he would use the money for drugs. Evidence during trial suggested that Frances was at her home at 7:00 p.m. and left no later than 7:20 before coming back. Frances said that on that evening while Adrian was watching television, she opened the medicine cabinet where Adrian kept his drugs and found a pistol there and took it. She said that earlier that day, Adrian told her that he got into some trouble, so she wanted to take the gun out of the house, so she put it in a duffel bag and brought it to her cousin's house. Frances said that on that evening while Adrian was watching television, she opened the medicine cabinet where Adrian kept his drugs and found a pistol there and took it. She said earlier that day Adrian told her that he got into some trouble and she did not want the gun in her house, so she took it out of the house and put it in a duffel bag and brought it to her cousin's house. Defense argued that police found the murder weapon a day after the murders and the results came back while Frances was at the police station, but she was never arrested. She was arrested 2 weeks later only because she and her mother tried collecting the life insurance money. Frances's father, B. Henry, signed an affidavit stating that police told him if ballistics failed to implicate her as the killer, she would be released, and she was released after the report. They were told that the gun found was not the murder weapon. During trial, police officers testified that the murder weapon presented during trial appeared to be similar to the one recovered and tested, but it was not identified by the serial number. Frances was found guilty on October 25, 1988, for the murders of Adrian, Alton, and Farah, and she was sentenced to death by method of lethal injection. Throughout her years on death row, there were many appeals. Her new representation claimed that on April 8, 1987, days after the murder, is when detectives went into Frances's apartment and asked for her to show them what she was wearing the day of the murders. She pointed them out, and that is when the clothes were taken in as evidence. With information like this, her appeals were still denied. Frances spent almost 18 years on death row and had received a 120-day stay of execution that was granted by Governor Perry because Frances's legal team claimed that evidence in her case was lacking and prior representation was not good. During the stay of execution, Frances's new legal aides claimed that there was a third gun found and the gun Frances had was not the murder weapon. They also said that trial transcripts from Frances's old lawyer, Ron Mock, admitted that he had not spoken to one witness.
Mock has already said he was tired, he didn't want to take the case. So he didn't even look, I don't even think he looked at the police report. You know, one of my neighbors said they heard gunshots at 7:30. Why weren't they brought to testify in trial? You know, I just saw that in the clemency report. You know, I never knew that. That person should have been brought to trial to testify. That was something the defense was supposed to do and never did.
They also said that Sandra testified and was quoted saying that Frances immediately screamed and bolted to the bedroom. She began to frantically scream uncontrollably. I could not calm her down enough to elicit the apartment's address. I know in my heart that after watching the reaction of Frances upon discovering her family's dead bodies, there is absolutely no way she had any involvement in their deaths. Frances's appeals were still denied, and her new execution date was scheduled for September 14, 2005. On execution day, Frances refused to request a last meal, and when it was time for the actual execution, she remained silent and offered no last words. Toni Jo Henry, born Annie Beatrice McQuiston, was born on January 3, 1916 in Louisiana. She was number 3 of 5 children, and they all initially lived with both parents. Unfortunately, in 1922, her mother became ill with tuberculosis and passed away, so Toni left to go live with her grandmother. Although she wanted to continue living with her grandmother, her father quickly remarried and requested that Toni come back home to live with him and his new wife. She was never truly happy living with them, and at the age of 13, she got her first job working at a macaroni factory. She did not have the job for long because her boss fired her after finding out she had a family history of tuberculosis, and he believed it to be contagious. Her father was extremely upset with her losing her job and not being able to assist with the family's living expenses, so Toni ended up running away. As she got older, she found refuge working as a prostitute in a brothel and became addicted to cocaine. Although cocaine was her drug of choice, she frequently drank and smoked weed as well. Throughout the years, she was arrested multiple times for her work or for getting into scuffles with men, but she never stayed in jail for long. When Toni was 23 years old, she met a John at her brothel by the name of Claude Cowboy Henry in Austin, Texas. Claude was a career criminal and a prize fighter who immediately fell in love with Toni's beauty. The two hit it off, and for the first time in her life, Toni felt as if she found a man who would respect her and treat her right. In Toni's own words, she said, "He gave me a home and he got that drug monkey off my back, and that drug monkey is a big, strong thing. I remember the day I told him I was a cokey and the look on his face. He thought I just smoked marijuana and grinned. But when I told him my train went a lot further than marijuana, he took me to a hotel room and I lay there in bed for a week, and he would come in now and then and ask me how I was doing. He would slap my face with a cold towel and we would both laugh." Infatuation turned into love, and the two agreed to marry. Before officially tying the knot, Claude went to a bar in San Antonio, Texas. He was drunk, got into an argument, and being the prize fighter he was, who did not back down from a fight, ended up getting into a bar fight. He won, leaving his opponent unconscious, and left thinking nothing of it. Soon after, he and Toni decided to get married on November 25, 1939, and the wedding was within a year of them meeting. After marrying, the two drove to California to enjoy their honeymoon. Upon returning to Texas after their honeymoon, Claude was arrested and charged with murder. Unbeknownst to him, the bar fight he got into before his wedding left a man by the name of Arthur Sinclair dead. Arthur was an off-duty police officer, and when trial began, the only reason why the death penalty was off the table for Claude was because Arthur was off-duty at the time of the fight, and Claude was unaware of Arthur's profession. Toni was in court every day supporting her husband, and when he received his 50-year sentence, she became hysterical in court and yelled that she would get him out. Toni later went on record and said that she had never suffered more in her life than when Claude was sentenced and sent to the Texas State Prison in Huntsville, Texas. Toni was serious when she screamed that she was going to get him out of prison and quickly started devising a plan because she needed money and someone to help her. Because of her work, she knew many career criminals, and she reached out to an old friend who was infatuated with her and would do anything for her. Harold Finnan Archie Burke. Archie was an army deserter turned drifter, and even though he knew he enlisted to help break Toni's husband out of prison and there was no chance of them being together, he was happy to be by her side. Toni was living in Beaumont, Texas at the time, so she and Archie robbed a local hardware store close by, and they were able to steal 16 guns. They were driving towards Arkansas and committed multiple robberies along the way. They both split the money, and Toni was getting closer to reaching her goal. They wanted to do one last big hit, which was robbing a bank in Stuttgart, Arkansas, and before doing so, they agreed to steal a car that would be used for their getaway car. It was Valentine's Day, February 14th, 1940. Tony and Archie were now in Lake Charles, Louisiana, ready to steal their getaway car. They were both hiding behind a bush near the shoulder of the highway, waiting for the perfect opportunity. Mind you, during this time, temperatures were low, lakes were frozen over, and there was even snow in certain areas. Tony then came out and stuck out her thumb pretending to be a hitchhiker. She was dolled up with her long black hair, waiting in the cold, and a man by the name of Joseph P. Calloway quickly spotted her and pulled over to help the woman in distress. He was a salesman and was driving a car he was delivering, which was a Ford Coupe, all the way back to his hometown of Houston, Texas. When he pulled over, Archie came out of the brush and they forced him out of the car, made him strip naked, and forced him in the trunk of his vehicle. When Tony shut the trunk, she shut it on Joseph's hand, which broke all of his knuckles. She and Archie then hopped in the car and drove a few miles away to a rice paddy field. The paddy field was next to a hayfield, and it was separated by a barbed wire. Tony and Archie pulled his body over the frozen ground, dragged him over the barbed wire divider, which tore Joseph's skin off in different areas of his body. They were all now in the hayfield, and Joseph was kneeling next to the haystacks, freezing and begging for his life. He spent minutes pleading with Tony and Archie and talking about his family, and the only reason Tony allowed him to continue talking was because she had to load her gun. She knew in her heart that she was already going to kill him. When she finished loading her gun, she told Joseph to start praying, and before he was able to get a complete word out, Tony said she shot him right above his eye. Tony and Archie made no effort to hide the body and left his naked body in the open hayfield. They took $15 that was in Joseph's pocket, burned his clothes, and got in Joseph's car to head for the bank in Arkansas. While on their drive, Archie had second thoughts and said he wanted to rest and hit the bank another day. He did not realize what Tony was truly capable of, and in Tony's own words, Archie turned yellow, and she knew he was having second thoughts, so angered by that, she hit him on the head with the butt of her gun. Now, with a change of plans, Tony and Archie split ways. Archie kept the car, and Tony took a bus to a brothel in Shreveport, Louisiana, where she used to work, because she thought she would be able to keep on the low there. Her aunt was a madam of the brothel, wanted no parts of what Tony was up to, and called her brother, who was Tony's uncle, to talk some sense into her. Her uncle George McQuiston, who also happened to be a Louisiana state trooper, was able to talk some sense into Tony by letting her know that there was no way she would be able to break her husband out of prison without living her life on the run and always looking over her shoulder. During this time, Joseph's body had been found, and when Tony was questioned by Shreveport police, she confessed and let them know where she committed the crime. She was arrested, charged with murder, and was granted 3 trials. Her first trial lasted just 2 days. It was from March 27th to March 29th, 1940, and a jury found her and Archie guilty, and they were both sentenced to die by hanging. During that first trial, Tony put the blame all on Archie and testified that he was the one who actually killed Joseph. Archie did not know Tony was going to turn on him, so he was not prepared to testify. Tony appealed her sentence and was granted a new trial due to the fact that media was all over the case, and she felt that the media attention gave the jury a preconceived notion of her, which ultimately sealed her fate in getting the death sentence. The second trial began the following year in February of 1941. For this trial, Archie finally testified against Tony, but nothing changed because they were again both sentenced to death. Her second appeal was granted for the same reason as the first, and the third trial began in January of 1942. She was again sentenced to death, and although she did try appealing a third time, the appeal was denied early November 1942, and her fate was sealed. If you remember, I mentioned that when she was first sentenced to death in 1940, the method was by hanging. But in the state of Louisiana in 1940, they changed their method of execution to electrocution by their infamous gruesome Gertie, which was effective in June of 1941. So when Tony was sentenced again in 1942, the method was by electrocution. Tony was sent to Lake Charles Prison and agreed to many interviews. In her death row area, there was a dog she befriended and called her niece. She also became close to Father Wayne Richard, who was a Catholic priest and had converted Tony to the Catholic faith. He baptized her, but although it appeared that her beliefs changed while on death row, it did not seem to affect how she felt about the victim. Tony was quoted saying, "I always knew there was a God running the show, but I thought I could steal just one little act. In the first place, the victim doesn't return to haunt me. I never think of him. I've known all along it would be my life for his. I believe mine is worth as much to me as his was to him. I wonder, though, sometimes, why it's legal now for some fellow to kill me." On November 24, 1942, Claude escaped from prison in an attempt to see his wife Tony before her execution, but he was captured and was not able to see her. 4 days later, though, on Tony's execution day, and before being taken out of her cell for her execution, the warden allowed her to have a final call with Claude. After her call, when she learned that her treasured hair had to be shaved off, she began to cry. She was then taken to a section of the Lake Charles Parish Jail where the traveling electric chair was set up. Tony showed more emotion for her hair than she ever did while on death row and being strapped in for her execution. She requested if she could wear a shawl to cover her bald head, and the warden agreed. When she walked into the execution room, she was wearing a sheer red shawl. Deputy Sheriff Kenny Reed read Tony's death warrant and asked if she had any final words, and she replied by saying, "I think not." She made no final statements, but when the executioner said, "Goodbye, Tony Joe," she whispered a soft thank you, which were her last words. In the execution room was Father Wayne Richard, and Tony smiled for the reporters and witnesses. She prayed to herself for a bit, and the executioner then placed the death mask over her face, and the execution began. She was pronounced dead at 12:12 p.m., and Father Richard officiated her funeral at the Lake Charles Cemetery. No family members claimed Tony's body, but Father Wayne honored Tony's last request of a crucifix being placed in her left hand with her so she could be buried with it. To date, she was the first and only woman to be sentenced to death by the method of electrocution and die by that method in the state of Louisiana. 26-year-old Archie was electrocuted in the same electric chair 4 months later on March 23, 1943. As for Tony's husband, Claude, he grew physically sick in prison after the death of Tony, and he was granted a hardship parole in 1945. He returned to his old ways of getting drunk and fighting in bars, though. Unfortunately for him, his prize-fighting style and bar fight wins came to an end when he chose to get into a fight with an armed bar owner who ended up shooting Claude in self-defense and killing him. The owner was never convicted or tried because of the witnesses at the bar confirming everything the owner had claimed.